The bailiff said, "All rise," and I stood up so fast my chair scraped the floor. I remember thinking that scrape sounded louder than it should have, the way small sounds get amplified when your whole body is humming with adrenaline. My lawyer wasn't there. I had told her 3 days earlier that I was going to handle this part myself, and she had looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "You sure about that, honey?" And I had said yes, and I had meant it. But standing there in that wood-paneled courtroom in downtown Hartford with my biological parents sitting 6 feet away from me at the other table, I wasn't so sure anymore. The woman I hadn't called Mom in 23 years was wearing a beige cardigan and clutching a tissue she hadn't used. The man I hadn't called Dad in 23 years had gotten heavier. His neck was wider than I remembered, and he kept clearing his throat in this wet way that made me think of basement smells. Their lawyer stood up. I stood up. Judge Whitaker, who had a face like a tired schoolteacher, looked down at her notes and said, "I see we have a pro se appearance from the defendant. Counselor, are you withdrawing?" And before my biological father's attorney could answer, I said, "She's not withdrawing, Your Honor. I'm just speaking first today." That was the first sentence I said in court. The next part of the story is how I got there. But to tell that, I have to go back to a Greyhound terminal in Springfield, Massachusetts, on a Tuesday in October, when I was 7 years old and my parents told me they were going to the bathroom and didn't come back. I want to be careful about how I describe that day, because I've told it so many times in therapy that I'm not sure anymore which details are real and which ones I've patched in over the years to make the memory hold its shape. But I know I was wearing a denim jacket that was too thin for the weather. I know my mother had given me a granola bar, the kind with chocolate chips, and I know I ate half of it, and saved the rest in the pocket of that jacket, because I thought I might want it later. I know my brother was already gone. He was 4 years older than me, and they had left him with my grandmother in Worcester 2 weeks before. I didn't understand why I wasn't going with him. I asked about it in the car on the way to Springfield, and my mother said, "Grandma only has room for one right now." We sat in the terminal for what I now know was about 40 minutes. My father bought me a small carton of apple juice from a vending machine. My mother kept looking at the clock above the ticket window. Then they both stood up at the same time, and my mother said, "We have to use the restroom. You stay right here. Don't talk to anyone. We'll be right back." I sat on that bench for 6 hours. A woman who worked at the snack counter noticed me first. She came over around hour 2, and she crouched down and asked where my parents were. And I told her exactly what they had told me to say, which was that they would be right back. She brought me a paper cup of water. She came back at hour 3 with the sandwich she said was left over. She came back at hour 4 with a Hartford police officer. The officer's name was Officer Boyd, and he had a mustache, and he asked me my name and my address and my phone number. And I told him all 3. I told him my mother's first name was Diane, and my father's first name was Patrick, and they had brown hair and a green car, a Buick. And the license plate had the letter F in it twice. I told him my school was Roosevelt Elementary, and my teacher was Miss Hollings, and my best friend was a girl named Becky who had a chipped front tooth. I told him everything I knew. I was good at remembering things. I had always been good at remembering things. He took me to the police station. I sat in a small room with a juice box and a coloring book about firefighters that I did not color in. A social worker came. Her name was Mrs. Ellsworth, and she had a soft voice and a clipboard, and she asked me the same questions Officer Boyd had asked. And I answered them again, the same way. They told me they were calling my parents. I want you to understand what happened next, because for years I didn't, and it took an investigator and a paper trail and a deposition transcript to put it together. My parents had moved. They had packed our 2-bedroom rental in Pittsfield, loaded everything they owned into a U-Haul, and driven to my aunt's house in Erie, Pennsylvania, 3 days before the bus station. The phone they listed on every form I had ever filled out at school had been disconnected. The address belonged to a family that had moved in the week before and had never heard of us. When the police ran my father's name, they found nothing recent. The car had been sold for cash 2 days earlier. They had not used their real names when they bought their bus tickets out of Springfield that night, and they did not buy them to Erie. They bought them to Albany, and from there they took a different bus, and from there they took another one. They had planned this. not the way you plan a birthday party. The way you plan a disappearance. 6 months later, my mother walked into a sheriff's office in Erie County and filed a missing child report. She said I had been kidnapped from a playground in Pittsfield. She gave a fake date. She cried in the right places. The detective who took her statement was overworked and undertrained, and the report went into a national database. And a month after that, my parents filed a claim on a life insurance policy they had taken out on me 3 years earlier through a small mutual company that specialized in child policies. $80,000. The policy paid out after a presumption of death clause was triggered by a separate filing they made through a paralegal in Ohio who didn't ask enough questions. By the time anyone could have connected the two halves of the story, my biological parents were in a rental house outside Tampa with a new mailbox and new names on the utility bills. And I was already living with the woman who would become my mother. Her name was Diane too. That was the first thing I noticed when the social worker introduced us, and I remember thinking that God had a strange sense of humor. She was 44 years old, a pediatric oncology nurse at Connecticut Children's, and she had been on the foster care registry for 9 years. She had fostered 11 children before me, ranging in age from 2 to 15. 3 of them she had adopted. 2 of those 3 were already in college by the time I came along. The third, a boy named Marcus who was a year younger than me, was waiting on the porch when Mrs. Ellsworth pulled into the driveway. I didn't talk to Diane for the first 3 weeks. I'm not proud of that, but I was 7, and I had been left at a bus station, and I had decided, with the kind of logic only a 7-year-old can produce, that talking was the problem. If I had talked less in the car that morning, if I had been quieter, easier, less, maybe my parents wouldn't have done it. So I stopped. I ate when she fed me. I went to school when she drove me. I slept in the bedroom she had painted pale yellow because the previous girl had liked yellow. I did not speak. The 4th week, she came into my room one night after I was supposed to be asleep, and she sat on the floor next to my bed. Not on it, on the floor. And she said, "I'm not going to make you talk, but I want you to know that nothing you say or don't say is going to change whether you live here. You live here now. That part isn't up to you, and it isn't up to me either. It's just true." I started crying. She didn't move. She just sat on the floor and let me cry. And when I was done, she stood up and said goodnight and turned off the light and left. And the next morning, I came down to breakfast, and I said, "Can I have toast?" And she said yes, like I had been asking for toast every morning my whole life. She taught me to make pancakes. She taught me to braid my own hair. She taught me how to read a paycheck. She taught me, very deliberately and over many years, that nothing about my biological parents was my fault. She said this when I was 8, and when I was 11, and when I was 16, and crying in the kitchen because a boy at school had called me a throwaway after he found out I was adopted. She said it the morning I got my acceptance letter to Wesleyan, and she said it the day I moved into my first apartment after graduation, sitting on a milk crate in a kitchen with no table yet, and she handed me a card that said, "From your mother," with no qualifier, because she did not believe a qualifier was required. She formally adopted me when I was 9. The paperwork went through faster than usual, because my biological parents could not be located to contest it, which is one of the rare gifts that came from their disappearance. She gave me her last name. I picked the middle name myself. I picked Rose after a character in a book I had loved when I was 8, and she let me, even though her own mother's name was also Rose and she could have suggested it, but didn't, because she wanted the choice to be mine. I want to tell you about her job, because it matters to what came later. Diane had been a pediatric oncology nurse for over 20 years by the time she adopted me. She worked the late shift most of my childhood, which meant she was home in the mornings when I went to school and asleep in the evenings when I came home. Marcus and I learned to make dinner together. I learned to be quiet between the hours of 3 and 7 on weekdays. I learned what nurses make, which is not very much. And I learned what nurses spend, which is everything, on rent and groceries and the constant low-grade emergency of raising children. When I was 14, she went back to school at night to get her nurse practitioner license. When I was 16, she got it. Her income went up. Not by a lot. Enough that we moved out of the rental on Asylum Avenue and into a small 2-bedroom in West Hartford, that she bought with a 30-year mortgage and a down payment she had been saving since before I was born. I had my own room with a window that faced a maple tree. Marcus had moved out by then, to a college in Pennsylvania. She kept working. Through my college years, she worked. Through her own diagnosis, the year I turned 26, she worked. Stage 2 ovarian, caught during a routine checkup. She had the surgery and the chemo, and she went back to work 3 weeks after her last infusion, against her doctor's advice, because she said the work was what kept her oriented in time. She made it 5 more years. She died at home, in the bed I had helped her pick out when she moved into the West Hartford house, and I was holding her hand. She was 63. She had not been rich, but she had been frugal and consistent, and she had been a senior nurse practitioner with 28 years of pension contributions, and she had also, as I would find out later, inherited a substantial sum from her own father, a quiet dentist in New Haven who had died when she was 30 and who had left her a portfolio she had never touched. The executor of her will was her lawyer, a woman named Pamela Sosa, who had handled Diane's affairs for over a decade. 3 weeks after the funeral, Pamela called me into her office and walked me through everything: the house, the pension, the portfolio her father had left her, which had grown for 33 years untouched, the life insurance she had on herself, separate from the policy through her hospital, the savings she had quietly added to for decades. The total, after taxes and fees, was a little over $4.1 million. I sat in Pamela's office for a long time. I think I said the word okay about 7 times, the way you do when you're trying to convince your own face to keep working. Pamela handed me a tissue and said, "She left a letter. Do you want to read it now or take it home?" I took it home. I read it in my car in the parking lot. I am not going to tell you what was in it. I sold the West Hartford house 6 months later, not because I needed the money, but because I could not walk through the kitchen anymore. I moved to a small place in Wethersfield. I went back to my job at the public defender's office, where I had been working for 3 years as a paralegal while I studied for the bar at night. I took the bar that February. I passed. I started practicing as a public defender that summer. It was in November, 14 months after Diane died, that the letter arrived. It was a thick envelope with a return address in Tampa, Florida, and a name I had not seen written down since I was a child: my biological father. The letter inside was 3 pages, handwritten, on lined paper. The handwriting was bad. He said he had been thinking about me. He said he had found me through a private investigator who specialized in reunions. He said he and my biological mother had made terrible choices and they had carried them for many years and they wanted to make things right. He said he was sorry. He said he loved me. He had not used my name correctly. He had used the name I was born with, not the name I had carried since I was 9. I did not respond. 3 weeks later, I was served at my office. The complaint was 46 pages long. They were suing me for the entirety of Diane's estate. The legal theory was creative, and I have to give their attorney credit for the creativity, even though it was also disgusting. They argued that the adoption decree obtained when I was 9 was procedurally defective because they had not been properly served. They argued that I was therefore still their biological child in the eyes of any equitable remedy, and that as my parents they had a claim to support and care that I had failed to provide during their later years, and that the estate of my purported adoptive mother should therefore be redirected through a constructive trust theory to compensate them for 2.5 decades of emotional damages and lost familial support. The number they were asking for was $3.8 million. They had done their research. They knew almost exactly what the estate was worth. I read the complaint twice, and then I called Pamela. And Pamela called a litigator she trusted named Hannah Brenner, and Hannah took the case. The first thing Hannah did was pull every record she could find: the Erie County Missing Child Report, the insurance claim, the presumption of death filing, the bus tickets, the bank records of the $80,000 payout, the U-Haul rental from the week of the bus station, the address change forms, the deed transfer on the Pittsfield rental, which had been signed before the bus station, the witness statement from the woman at the snack counter, which I had never read and which Hannah retrieved from a 40-year-old microfiche. Hannah asked me, at our second meeting, what kind of outcome I wanted. She said it carefully. She said some clients want to win on the merits and walk away. Some clients want public vindication. Some clients want public vindication. Some clients want criminal referrals. I thought about it for a long time. I told her I wanted 3 things. I wanted to win. I wanted the insurance company to know, because they had paid out $80,000 on a policy that had been fraudulently triggered, and they had a right to recover it. And I wanted to speak in court, not through her, through myself. Not for the whole case, but for one part, for the standing argument. Hannah did not love this idea. She told me professionally and honestly that pro se appearances by represented parties were unusual, and that judges sometimes found them irritating. I told her I understood. I told her I had been a paralegal for 3 years, and I had been an attorney for 14 months, and I had argued 17 suppression motions in Superior Court, and I was not going to ask a stranger to say the first words I said to my biological parents in 23 years. She thought about that for a minute, and then she said okay. The hearing on the motion to dismiss for lack of standing was scheduled for a Wednesday in March. The courthouse was the same courthouse where I had argued my second ever motion as a public defender. I knew the courtrooms. I knew where the bathrooms were. I knew which clerks would smile at me and which ones wouldn't. I wore a navy suit because I had been told once, by a judge I respected, that navy reads as serious without reading as severe. I did not bring notes. I had written notes and I had memorized them, and then I had thrown them away because I did not want to look down. The bailiff said, "All rise." I stood. The judge sat. The case was called. Their attorney introduced himself. I introduced myself. I introduced myself. The judge asked Hannah if she was withdrawing. I said no, she's not withdrawing. I'm just speaking first today. The judge gave me a small look that I think was approval and asked me to proceed. I said good morning, and I introduced myself by my legal name. My full legal name, including the middle name Rose and the last name that was not the last name on the complaint. And then I said this. I said the plaintiffs in this case are listed as my biological parents. The complaint asserts that I am their child and that they have parental standing to seek equitable relief. Before this court reaches the question of equitable relief, this court must reach the question of standing. And before this court reaches the question of standing, this court must reach the question of fact. And the question of fact is whether the plaintiffs in this case are who they say they are, and whether they did what the public record shows they did. Because if they did what the public record shows they did, then they do not have standing as parents under Connecticut law. They have status as perpetrators of child abandonment under Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 119, Section 39, and as participants in insurance fraud under federal mail fraud statutes. And the only equitable relief available to them in this courtroom is the right to receive a referral from this bench to the Hartford County State's Attorney. I then introduced the documents, the bus tickets, the U-Haul rental, the insurance claim, the bus tickets, the U-Haul rental, the insurance claim, the presumption of death filing, the $80,000 payout, the Erie County Missing Child Report with the falsified date, the microfished witness statement from the snack counter woman, who was named Mrs. Yolanda Pritchard and who was still alive and who lived in Chicopee, the deposition affidavit from Officer Boyd, who was retired now and lived in Florida, the adoption decree from 2002, the death certificate of my mother, the will. I introduced all of it. The plaintiff's attorney objected. The judge overruled him gently. I kept going. I spoke for 22 minutes. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at my biological parents for the first 18 minutes. When I did look at them, in the last 4 minutes, I looked at them once each, and I said, "Your Honor, the plaintiffs are not asking this court to make them whole. They are asking this court to make them paid. And the woman who made me whole has been dead for 14 months and she did not leave me a fortune. She left me a record. The record of a 35-year career caring for sick children. The record of 11 foster placements. The record of 3 adoptions. The record of a marriage to her work and to her family, and to the principle that abandoned children are not waste. The money in her estate is the residue of that record. It is not severable from it, and the plaintiffs in this case are asking the court to award them the residue of a record they had no part in building, in compensation for damages they themselves caused, on the basis of a parental relationship they themselves terminated at a Greyhound terminal in Springfield, Massachusetts, on October the 8th, 1998. I move for dismissal with prejudice, and I respectfully request that this court order a referral to the state's attorney for review of the underlying conduct. I sat down. I did not look at my biological parents. The judge took a 15-minute recess. When she came back, she granted the motion to dismiss with prejudice. She also issued a referral order to the Hartford County State's Attorney and a copy directive to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Connecticut regarding the insurance fraud question. She made some other findings that I will not bore you with, but the substance of them was that the plaintiffs had brought the action in bad faith, and she awarded Hannah's fees against them, which was a thing I had not asked for, but which Hannah had asked for in a sealed supplemental motion that I hadn't known about. The insurance company sued my biological parents 9 months later. They had been sitting on the file for years, and they had been waiting for the opportunity. They recovered the full $80,000 plus interest, plus penalties, plus their attorney's fees, and they did it through a Florida court, which made it harder for my biological parents to hide. The state's attorney in Hartford reviewed the file and declined to prosecute due to the age of the abandonment, but the Massachusetts state's attorney took a different view and filed charges that were still active when my biological father died of a heart attack in a Tampa hospital 18 months later. My biological mother pled to a reduced count. She served 8 months. I did not attend the proceedings. My older brother, the one who had been left at our grandmother's, found me through a Facebook message 6 weeks after the dismissal. He had been looking for me for 3 years. He had grown up with our grandmother, who had been honest with him about what happened and who had tried, unsuccessfully, to find me when she was alive. She had died when he was 19. He had a wife and a daughter now. The daughter was 7. We did a video call. He cried first. I cried second. He flew up to Hartford the next month with his wife and his daughter, and I made them pancakes the way Diane had taught me, and I told his daughter that her aunt's middle name was Rose, and she told me that her middle name was Joy, and we held hands for a minute over the kitchen counter, and that was as much as I could do that day. And it was enough. In the spring, with Pamela's help, I established the Diane Rosalind Westmore Foundation, named for the woman who had adopted me, using $1.2 million of the estate as initial capitalization. The foundation does one thing. It pays the legal fees of foster parents seeking to adopt children whose biological parents cannot be located or have abandoned the children in the 4 New England states. We have funded 83 adoptions in the first 2 years. The smallest grant was $700. The largest was $19,000. I sit on the board with Pamela and with Marcus, who is now a high school chemistry teacher in Philadelphia, and with my brother, whose name I will not give you here because his daughter does not yet know all of this story, and I want him to be the one to tell her when she is ready. I kept the bed she died in. I had it moved to my house in Wethersfield, and I had a new mattress put on it, and I sleep in it now, which some people find morbid, but which I find ordinary. Because the bed was just a bed and she was just a person, and the work of grieving her has been the work of letting her be a person and not a relic. I kept the granola bar wrapper, the one from the bus station. I had it in the pocket of the denim jacket for 2 years, and then in a drawer for a decade, and then in a small box. And I still have it. I do not know why I kept it. I do not know what it is for. It is just a piece of plastic with chocolate chip writing on it, faded almost to nothing, and sometimes I take it out and look at it, and sometimes I don't. I think about that woman at the snack counter often. Mrs. Yolanda Pritchard. She is in her 80s now. I sent her a letter after the case ended, and we have written back and forth a few times. And once I drove out to Shakopee, and we had lunch in a diner near her apartment, and she told me she had not thought about that afternoon in many years until my lawyer's investigator showed up at her door. She told me she had thought I was a quiet child. She told me she had hoped someone good would find me. I told her someone good had. If the people who were supposed to love you had decided you were a line item instead, how long would it take you to stop expecting them to come back? And when they finally did come back, decades later, with their hands out and their lawyers behind them, what would you say to them? I had 23 years to think about my answer. I gave it in 22 minutes in a Hartford courtroom on a Wednesday in March. And then I went home and I made dinner, and I went to sleep in the bed that had belonged to my mother. I've thought a lot, in the years since that Wednesday in March, about what it actually was that won me the case. It wasn't the documents. Though the documents mattered. It wasn't the 22 minutes of speaking, though those mattered too. It was something Diane started building in me when I was 8 years old. Sitting at her kitchen table refusing to eat my toast, and it took me most of my life to recognize it for what it was. She gave me 3 things. She gave me the conviction that what happened at the bus station was not a verdict on me. She gave me the patience to sit with hard questions long enough to find honest answers. And she gave me, through her own ordinary daily example, the proof that a person can choose, every morning, to be the kind of person they want to be, regardless of what was done to them, or what they were handed at birth. I didn't know I was being taught any of this at the time. I thought I was just being raised. But cause and effect work quietly in a life. The choices my biological parents made in 1998 produced an $80,000 payout and 23 years of running. The choices Diane made over those same 23 years produced a foster care registry application, an adoption decree, a college tuition check she could barely afford, 1,000 small dinners, and eventually, a will. 2 parallel lives, 2 sets of choices, 2 different harvests at the end. I want to be careful not to make this sound clean, because it isn't. I am not a person who has transcended what happened to me. I still flinch when I hear a vending machine. I still sometimes wake up at 3 in the morning and check that my front door is locked and then check it again. The work of being okay is not finished and probably won't be. But I have come to believe that the question is not whether bad things shape us. The question is what we agree to build out of the shape they leave behind. My biological parents had every advantage Diane did not. They had each other. They had their health. They had a home they walked away from. They had 2 children who would have loved them if they had let us. They chose, against all of that, to take the smaller path. To run. To lie. To cash a check on a child they claimed was dead. And the universe, which is not a moral agent but is a record keeper, eventually presented them with the consequences of their own ledger. If you are listening to this, and you are carrying something heavy from your own childhood, I want to tell you the only true thing I know. Nobody can return to you what was taken. Not a court order, not an apology, not a payout. What you can do is decide, today, in the small ordinary way that Diane decided every morning of her life, who you are going to be from here. That decision is yours. It cannot be appealed. It cannot be sued for. And it is, in the end, the only inheritance that matters.